Being intelligent sounds like an advantage, something people admire, something people strive for. But what if it comes at a cost? What if the same mind that helps you understand the world also makes it harder to live in it? Because according to Carl Jung, the more aware you become, the harder it is to ignore what others don't see, the contradictions, the patterns, the truth beneath the surface. And once you see those things, you can't unsee them, which means you can't go back to being comfortable. Intelligence is not just knowledge. It is awareness, the ability to see more, to notice more, to understand more. But that ability changes everything. You don't just see what's obvious. You see what's beneath it, the hidden patterns, the contradictions, the things others overlook. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You notice how people speak, what they say, what they don't say, the gaps, the inconsistencies, the underlying motives. You pick up on tone, energy, subtle shifts, things most people ignore. And this creates distance, not physical distance, but psychological distance. Because your experience of reality is not the same as theirs. Conversations feel shallow, repetitive, predictable. You already know where they're going. You already see the conclusion before they even get there. So you lose interest, not because you want to, but because your mind moves faster, deeper, further. And that creates a sense of isolation. Because connection requires shared experience, shared perception, shared understanding. But when you see differently, it becomes harder to relate, harder to feel understood, harder to feel seen. According to Carl Jung, the more conscious you become, the more responsibility you carry. Because awareness removes ignorance, and ignorance protects comfort. When you don't see something, it doesn't affect you. But when you do see it, you have to deal with it. You have to think about it, process it, understand it. And that takes energy, a lot of energy, because your mind doesn't stop at the surface. It keeps going, asking questions. Why is this like this? What does this mean? What's behind it? What caused it? And each answer leads to more questions, more layers, more complexity, until simple things are no longer simple. You can't just accept things as they are. You need to understand them, break them down, analyze them. And this becomes automatic, not a choice, a pattern, a way of thinking. You walk into a situation, and your mind immediately starts scanning, observing, interpreting. You notice dynamics, power structures, emotional undercurrents, unspoken tensions. You read between the lines, even when you don't want to, even when it would be easier not to. But you can't turn it off. And that's where the wait begins. Because awareness doesn't come with a switch. You can't decide when to see and when not to see. You just see all the time. And that affects how you feel. Because you become aware of things that are uncomfortable, unresolved, imperfect. You see flaws in systems, in people, in yourself. And that creates tension. Because awareness doesn't just reveal truth. It reveals imperfection, contradiction, conflict. You notice when things don't align, when words don't match actions, when values don't match behavior. And that makes it harder to trust, harder to relax, harder to simply accept things. Because your mind keeps questioning, is this real? Is this genuine? Is this consistent? And that constant questioning creates distance, not just from others, but from experience itself. You are not just living. You are analyzing your life as it happens, watching yourself think, watching yourself feel, observing your own reactions. And this creates a split between the part of you that experiences and the part of you that observes. And while that can bring insight, it also creates detachment because you are never fully immersed, never fully present. You are always slightly outside the moment, thinking about it, understanding it, interpreting it. And that makes it harder to enjoy simple things because your mind complicates them. You go deeper, ask more, think more, feel more. And sometimes that depth becomes overwhelming because life is not always clear, not always logical, not always meaningful, but your mind expects it to be. It searches for patterns, for reasons, for explanations. And when it doesn't find them, it keeps searching, creating loops, cycles of thought, trying to resolve something that may not have a clear answer. And that leads to overthinking, not as a habit, but as a consequence, a natural result of how your mind works. You replay conversations, analyze decisions, question outcomes, think about what could have been said, what could have been done differently, not to dwell, but to understand, to improve, to make sense of things. But that process doesn't always end. It keeps going, repeating, expanding, and that becomes exhausting because your mind never truly rests. Even when everything is quiet, even when nothing is happening, it continues, thinking, processing, analyzing, and that constant activity creates mental fatigue, a subtle exhaustion that builds over time. Because rest is not just physical, it is mental. And when your mind is always active, true rest becomes difficult. You may sit still, but your thoughts don't. You may try to relax, but your mind keeps moving. And this creates a sense of tension, a background noise that never fully disappears. And over time, you begin to feel it, a constant pressure, a need to figure things out, to understand everything, to make sense of life. But life is not always meant to be fully understood, and that creates conflict because your mind wants clarity. But reality often offers ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, and that gap between what you want to understand and what you can understand creates frustration, a sense of incompleteness, because there is always something unresolved, something unclear, something unanswered, and your mind keeps returning to it, trying to close the loop, trying to find resolution. But not everything can be resolved. Not everything can be explained. And accepting that is difficult, especially when your nature is to understand, to analyze, to go deeper. And this is where intelligence becomes a burden, not because it is negative, but because it amplifies everything. Your awareness, your thoughts, your emotions, your perception, everything becomes more intense, more detailed, more complex. You don't just feel emotions. You analyze them, understand them, question them. You don't just experience life. You interpret it, break it down, examine it. And while that brings insight, it also brings weight because you are carrying more information, more awareness, more understanding. And that weight is not always visible from the outside. You may seem calm, composed, in control, but internally, there is constant movement, constant activity, constant depth. And that depth can feel isolating because it's hard to share, hard to explain, hard to communicate. Not everyone understands that way. Not everyone processes that way. So you simplify, you filter, you hold things back because explaining everything would take too long, too much effort. And even then, it may not be fully understood. So you stay quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because you have too much. And that silence adds to the feeling of disconnection because your internal world is rich, complex, detailed, but your external expression is limited, condensed, simplified. And that creates a gap between what you experience and what you share. And over time, that gap grows because your mind keeps expanding, keeps exploring, keeps understanding, but your environment may not match that depth. And that mismatch creates loneliness, not because you are alone, but because you feel unseen, unmatched, unmet. And this is one of the hidden costs of intelligence, not the ability itself, but the experience that comes with it, the awareness, the depth, the constant thinking, the constant processing, the inability to switch it off. And this is what Jung pointed toward. That increasing awareness changes your relationship with life. It removes certain illusions, certain comforts, certain simplicities, and replaces them with complexity, with depth, with truth. And truth is not always comfortable. It challenges, it exposes, it reveals things you may not want to see, but once you see them, you can't go back. And that is the paradox. Intelligence expands your world, but it also complicates it. It gives you insight, but takes away simplicity. It brings clarity, but also uncertainty. Because the more you understand, the more you realize how much you don't. And that awareness can feel heavy because it never ends. There is always more to see, more to understand, more to question, more to explore. And that process does not stop. It continues, expanding, deepening, evolving. And you are inside it, experiencing it, living it, all the time. And that is where the challenge lies. Not in being intelligent, but in carrying that awareness, living with that depth, navigating that constant mental activity, and learning how to exist within it without being overwhelmed by it. Intelligence does not only change how you think, it changes how you feel. Because the deeper you understand something, the deeper you experience it. You don't just notice problems, you feel the weight of them. You don't just recognize patterns, you see where they lead. You don't just observe reality, you interpret it. And that interpretation adds emotional depth, sometimes too much. According to Carl Jung, awareness and suffering are connected, not because awareness creates pain, but because it removes illusions. And illusions protect you. They simplify reality. They make things easier to accept, easier to ignore, easier to move through. But when those illusions disappear, you are left with complexity, with contradiction, with truth. And truth is not always comfortable. You begin to see how people operate, not just what they do, but why they do it. Their insecurities, their fears, their unconscious motivations. You see patterns in behavior, repetitions across different people, the same dynamics, different faces. And this creates a strange awareness, because you realize a lot of what happens is not fully conscious. People think they are choosing, but often they are reacting, following patterns, repeating cycles. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to ignore. You notice it in conversations, in relationships, in yourself. And this awareness creates tension, because part of you wants authenticity, clarity, truth. But reality often doesn't match that. People contradict themselves, say one thing, do another, avoid what they feel, deny what they know. And you see it clearly. And that makes it harder to engage normally, harder to accept things at face value, harder to just go along. Because your mind keeps questioning what's real, what's genuine, what's actually happening here. And that constant questioning can become exhausting, because there is no off switch. You don't choose to analyze, you just do, automatically. And this extends to yourself. You don't just experience emotions, you examine them. Why do I feel this? Where is this coming from? What does this mean? And while this brings insight, it also creates intensity, because you are not just feeling, you are processing while feeling, understanding while experiencing. And that adds layers, layers that can become overwhelming. Because sometimes you don't want to analyze, you just want to feel. But your mind doesn't stop. It continues, breaking things down, looking deeper, searching for meaning. And this creates a kind of internal pressure, a need to resolve things, to understand them fully, to make sense of everything. But not everything makes sense. Not everything has a clear explanation. And that creates frustration, because your mind keeps searching, even when there is nothing to find. And this leads to overthinking, not as a flaw, but as a function, a result of high awareness. Your mind doesn't settle easily. It keeps moving, exploring possibilities, running scenarios, testing ideas, trying to reach certainty. But certainty is limited, and the more you seek it, the more you realize how little there is. Because every answer leads to more questions. Every conclusion opens another layer. And this creates a loop, a continuous cycle of thought that rarely fully resolves. And over time, that loop becomes draining, because your mind is always active, always engaged, always working, even when nothing external is happening. And this affects your emotional state, because constant thinking creates constant stimulation, and constant stimulation prevents rest. You may be physically still, but mentally, you are moving, processing, analyzing, and that creates fatigue. not obvious at first, but gradual, accumulating over time, until you feel tired, without knowing why. And this is where intelligence begins to feel like a burden, not because of what you know, but because of how you process, how deeply you engage, how constantly you think. And this affects your relationships. Because communication becomes difficult, you think in layers, in complexity, in nuance. But most conversations are simple, surface level, direct, and translating your thoughts into something concise becomes challenging. You either simplify too much or say too little, because explaining everything would take too long, and even then, it may not be fully understood. So you hold back, you adapt, you adjust your expression to fit the situation, to fit the person, and that creates a disconnect, because what you express is not always what you fully experience, and that can feel isolating, because you are not fully seen, not fully understood, not fully met. And over time, that creates distance, not because you want it, but because it happens naturally. As your internal world expands, and your external interactions remain limited, and this leads to another layer, self-awareness, not just awareness of others, but awareness of yourself, your patterns, your reactions, your flaws, your contradictions. You see your own inconsistencies, your own avoidance, your own defense mechanisms, and that awareness can be uncomfortable because you can't ignore it. You see where you fall short, where you repeat patterns, where you contradict your own values. And that creates internal tension, because awareness demands change. It doesn't let you stay unconscious. It doesn't let you pretend. And that pressure can feel overwhelming, because you are constantly evaluating yourself, reflecting, adjusting, trying to align, trying to improve, trying to understand. And while that leads to growth, it also creates weight, because you are always engaged, always aware, always processing. And this constant awareness can make it difficult to relax, to simply exist, without analyzing, without evaluating, without thinking ahead. And this is where the paradox becomes clear. The very thing that gives you depth also creates difficulty. The ability to understand more also means you feel more, think more, process more, and that intensity can become overwhelming, if not balanced, if not grounded, because awareness without grounding leads to instability, to overthinking, to emotional overload, to mental fatigue. And this is what Jung pointed toward, that awareness must be integrated, not just accumulated, because understanding without integration creates imbalance. You see everything, but you don't know how to hold it, how to live with it, how to exist within it. And that is where the real work begins, not in becoming more aware, but in learning how to live with that awareness, without being consumed by it, without being overwhelmed by it, without losing yourself in it. Because intelligence is not the problem. The problem is imbalance. Too much thinking, not enough grounding. Too much analysis, not enough presence. Too much awareness, not enough integration. And until that balance is developed, intelligence can feel like a curse, not because it is negative, but because it is unmanaged, unintegrated, uncontained. And that is where the shift must happen, from accumulation to integration, from constant thinking to conscious awareness, from overload to balance, because only then does intelligence become what it was meant to be, not a burden, but a tool, not something that overwhelms you, but something that supports you. And that shift changes everything. At a certain point, the problem is no longer intelligence itself. It's what you do with it, because awareness without direction becomes noise, constant thinking, constant analysis, constant questioning, but no resolution, no grounding, no stillness. And this is where the real struggle begins. According to Carl Jung, the psyche is not meant to stay in analysis forever. It is meant to move toward integration, toward wholeness. But intelligence can interrupt that process, because it keeps you in your head, in thought, in abstraction. You understand everything, but you don't always embody it. You see patterns, but you don't always break them. You analyze emotions, but you don't always feel them fully. And that creates a split between knowing and being. You know what you should do. You know what's healthy. You know what's aligned. But action becomes difficult because your mind keeps adding layers. More considerations, more possibilities, more outcomes, until a simple decision feels complex, heavy, overwhelming. And this leads to hesitation, indecision, not because you lack clarity, but because you see too many angles, too many consequences, too many potential outcomes. And that makes movement harder because every step feels uncertain, not because you don't understand, but because you understand too much. And this creates a paradox. Your intelligence gives you clarity, but also creates doubt, because the more you see, the more you question every decision, every path, every possibility. And that constant questioning slows you down. You think before you act, then think again, then reconsider, then analyze further. And by the time you're ready, the moment has passed, or the energy is gone, or the opportunity has shifted. And this pattern repeats, not because you are incapable, but because you are overengaged, too mentally involved, too aware of every variable. And this creates frustration, because you know you can do more, be more, act more, but something holds you back. Not fear in the obvious sense, but complexity, the weight of too many perspectives, too many considerations. And this is where intelligence becomes limiting, not because it reduces your ability, but because it fragments your focus. It pulls you in multiple directions. Simultaneously, you see the pros, the cons, the risks, the rewards, the alternatives, all at once. And that makes it difficult to commit, to choose, to move forward with certainty, because certainty feels incomplete, limited, and your mind resists that. It wants full understanding, full clarity, full resolution. But life doesn't offer that. It requires movement, without complete certainty. And this is where tension builds, because your mind wants to wait, to understand more, to analyze further. But life keeps moving. Opportunities don't pause. Moments don't wait. And that creates pressure, internal pressure, a sense of being stuck. Not because you don't know what to do, but because you know too much. And this extends beyond decisions, into identity. Because the more aware you become, the more you question who you are, your beliefs, your values, your direction. You see how identity is shaped, influenced, conditioned. And that makes it harder to hold on to anything firmly, because you see its flexibility, its impermanence, its constructed nature. And that can feel destabilizing, because identity provides structure, a sense of self. But when you see through it, that structure becomes less solid, less fixed, more fluid. And while that can be freeing, it can also feel disorienting, because you are no longer anchored in certainty. You are aware of change, of possibility, of contradiction within yourself. And this creates internal movement, constant reevaluation, constant adjustment, constant questioning. Who am I? What do I believe? What do I want? And those questions don't always have stable answers. They shift, evolve, change over time. And that makes it harder to feel grounded, because the ground itself feels unstable. And this is where intelligence can create existential tension, not just practical difficulty, but deeper questioning about meaning, purpose, direction. You don't just live life, you question it. Why am I here? What is the point? What matters? And those questions do not have simple answers. They open space, complexity, ambiguity, and sitting with that requires strength, because there is no quick resolution, no final conclusion, only ongoing exploration. And this can feel heavy, because your mind wants closure. But existence offers openness, and that gap creates discomfort, a sense of searching, of not fully arriving, of always being in process. And this is where many people struggle, because intelligence brings awareness of this process, of this uncertainty, of this lack of final answers. And without grounding, that awareness can become overwhelming. You get lost in thought, in abstraction, in endless questioning, without anchoring in experience, in reality, in presence. And this is where the shift must happen, from thinking to being, from analyzing life to living it. Because understanding alone is not enough. You can understand everything and still feel lost, still feel disconnected, still feel overwhelmed. Because understanding is only one part. Integration is the other. Bringing awareness into action, into experience, into reality, allowing yourself to act, even without complete certainty, to feel, without needing to analyze every emotion, to live, without needing to understand everything first. And this is difficult, especially for a highly aware mind, because it goes against your instinct. Your instinct is to think, to analyze, to understand. But growth requires something different. The ability to step out of thought, into experience, into presence, into action, without overprocessing, without overanalyzing. And this is where intelligence transforms from a burden into a tool, because now it supports you instead of controlling you. You can think deeply, but also act freely. You can analyze, but also experience. You can understand, but also live. And that balance is what changes everything. Because the curse was never intelligence. It was imbalance. Too much mind, not enough grounding. Too much analysis, not enough embodiment. And once that balance is developed, everything shifts. Your mind becomes clearer. Your decisions become easier. Your experience becomes richer. Not because you think less, but because you are no longer trapped in thought. You can move between thinking and being, awareness and action, understanding and experience. And that is where intelligence becomes powerful, not overwhelming, not limiting, but aligned, integrated, and finally, useful. At a certain point, you begin to realize something important. The problem was never your intelligence. It was your relationship with it. Because for a long time, it felt like something you had to manage, control, even escape from. The constant thinking, the constant awareness, the constant depth. It felt overwhelming, like your mind was working against you. But slowly, that perception begins to change. You start to see that intelligence is not the enemy. Unconscious use of it is. According to Carl Jung, the goal is not to think less. It is to become conscious of how you think, to recognize when your mind is helping you and when it is trapping you. Because there is a difference. There is a difference between thinking and being consumed by thought, between awareness and over-identification with awareness, between understanding and endless analysis. And once you begin to see that difference, you gain something new. Distance. Not distance from life, but distance from your thoughts. The ability to observe them without immediately following them, without being pulled into every loop, every question, every layer. And that changes everything. Because now, your mind is no longer in control of you. You are in relationship with it. You can choose when to engage and when to step back. You can think deeply without getting lost. You can analyze without becoming overwhelmed. And this creates space. Space for something that was missing. Presence. The ability to be in a moment without breaking it down, without interpreting it, without needing to understand it fully, just experiencing it as it is. And this is where a new kind of balance forms. Not the absence of thought, but the integration of it, where thinking and being coexist without conflict, without dominance. Because before, thinking dominated everything. It shaped every experience, filtered every moment, controlled every reaction. But now, it becomes one part of a larger system, a tool, not the center. And this shift allows something else to emerge, a quieter awareness, one that does not analyze constantly, but simply notices, observes, without judgment, without urgency. And this awareness is different. It is not trying to solve, not trying to understand everything. It is simply present. And in that presence, you begin to feel something unfamiliar. Calm. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of pressure. The absence of the need to figure everything out. And that calm changes your experience of life. Because now, you are not constantly searching for answers. You are allowing them to come, naturally, in their own time, without force, without overthinking. And this creates trust. Not blind trust, but grounded trust. Trust in your ability to think when needed and to let go when it's not. Trust in your ability to understand without needing to understand everything. Trust in your ability to live without overanalyzing every moment. And that trust creates freedom. Freedom from the constant mental loop. Freedom from the pressure to resolve everything. Freedom from the need to always go deeper. Because you realize something simple. Depth is not always necessary. Not every moment needs to be analyzed. Not every experience needs to be understood. Some things are meant to be lived, felt, experienced, without explanation. And allowing that creates balance. A balance that was missing before. Because before, everything went through your mind. Every experience, every emotion, every interaction. But now, some things can pass through you without being dissected, without being broken down, without being turned into thought. And that makes life lighter, less heavy, less intense, less overwhelming. Not because you lost your intelligence, but because you are no longer carrying it all the time. You are no longer using it constantly, unconsciously, automatically. You are choosing when to engage it and when to rest from it. And this is where intelligence transforms from a curse into a strength. Because now, it works for you instead of against you. You can access depth without drowning in it. You can explore complexity without being consumed by it. You can understand deeply without losing simplicity. And this integration changes your entire experience. You feel more grounded, more stable, more present, because your awareness is no longer scattered. It is centered, balanced, available. And this also changes how you relate to others. Because now, you don't need to analyze everything they say, everything they do. You can listen, engage, experience the interaction without constantly interpreting it. And that creates connection, real connection, because you are present, not just mentally, but emotionally, experientially. And this reduces the distance you once felt, because you are no longer living only in your mind. You are participating in reality fully. And that is where the shift becomes complete. Not when you stop thinking, but when thinking no longer dominates your existence. When it becomes one part of who you are, not the entirety of it. And this is what Jung pointed toward. Not the elimination of complexity, but the integration of it. The ability to hold awareness without being overwhelmed by it. To hold depth without losing simplicity. To hold intelligence without being consumed by it. And when that happens, something changes at the core. You no longer feel trapped in your own mind. You feel supported by it, guided by it, but not controlled by it. And that is the difference between intelligence as a burden and intelligence as a gift. It is not about how much you know or how deeply you think. It is about whether you are lost in it or grounded within it. Because when you are grounded, when you are aware, when you are integrated, intelligence stops being a curse and becomes exactly what it was meant to be. A tool for understanding, a tool for growth, a tool for living more consciously, not more heavily, not more painfully, but more clearly, more fully, and more freely. If this felt a little too accurate, that's not coincidence. That's awareness. And according to Carl Jung, awareness is the first step, but it's not the final one. Because understanding your mind is not the same as mastering it. So here's the question most people avoid. Are you using your intelligence, or is it using you? Take a moment. Be honest. Because if your mind never stops, if you're always thinking, always analyzing, always questioning, then maybe the problem isn't your intelligence. Maybe it's that you've never learned how to step outside of it. And that's where real change begins. Not by thinking more, but by becoming aware of the thinking itself. If you're ready to stop feeling trapped in your own mind and start turning your awareness into something powerful, then subscribe. Because this isn't about becoming smarter. It's about becoming free.